My name is Ashley Jansen and I am Death Positive Ash. On this channel, we talk about death positive content, life as a death doula, and anti-MLM content. So if you are new here, thank you so much for joining me. If you're not new, thank you for swinging back. I really appreciate it. If you like this video and you like the content I'm doing, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. It would mean the world to me. I know I am just a beginner, but yeah, it would mean so much if you could join me on this wild and crazy journey. So, today we are talking about thanatophobia, also known as death anxiety, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with it. I talked a little bit about that in my first upload, but I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about that, and then we're going to talk about a theory called terror management, and we will talk about what death anxiety is versus what it is not, in my opinion. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So, where my death anxiety, thanatophobia journey started was when I was probably around 3 or 4 years old when one of my cats died. And my parents didn't really know what to say to me. And so they ended up lying to me and telling me that the cat had run off and started a new life. Just to make it clear, I don't blame my parents for doing this. I think they were just trying to do the best thing, given how young they were and also the death anxiety that they were experiencing and the grief that they were experiencing going through this pet loss that they were going through. That was the first encounter I had with talking about death and dying. And so after that, I was always a very curious kid about death and dying. So I just continued to ask questions, just try to learn everything that I could about it. And something that I noticed over time was that questions that I was asking were making the adults in my life really uncomfortable. So I was kind of seeing that anytime I would bring up death and dying or talk about it or ask questions, the adults in my life would get kind of awkward or change the subject. And so I would kind of get that message that it wasn't really a good to talk about or to share about. And so I started to not talk to people about it. So anytime I was curious about death and dying or I wanted to ask a question, I ended up just keeping it for myself and letting it kind of stew because I knew that if I brought it up, it was going to be an uncomfortable situation for the person that I was talking to. So over time, I decided to just keep it to myself. But in the process, I realize now that I was kind of judging myself in that process too. So then when I was 16 or 17, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and health anxiety disorder. And this came from me stewing and thinking about death and dying a lot and not being able to have a healthy outlet. And so I was keeping it to myself, but it wasn't serving me because it was really allowing me to judge myself for having these thoughts. Just thinking that I was very weird for wanting to know about it because everybody in my life didn't want to talk about it or learn about it, and here I was, kind of the oddball or the odd one out. So, yeah, then I went to counseling, and we didn't really touch on death anxiety, death anxiety in particular because that wasn't my diagnosis. My diagnosis was with health anxiety, so we kind of just focused on the death anxiety part. So fast forward to when I was doing my yoga teacher training, a panic attack about existential issues, and one of my fellow yoga teachers came up to me and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, I'm scared that we're all gonna die soon or later or anytime." And she's like, "Yeah, we're all gonna die. Yeah, that's true." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, that is what I'm scared of. It kind of was just like a light bulb came on. Okay, that is what I'm afraid of. So that was maybe around like when I was 22, about 2 years ago. And so even that kind of really took a huge weight off of my shoulders because I could like actually point to something and say, this is what I'm afraid of. And nobody, not even me, I didn't even think I was afraid of death. I thought I was afraid of illness and getting sick. But really, I was really, truly worried about death and dying. And dying, in particular, being the sickness, and death being, what is my legacy going to be? And what is going to happen after I die? I was starting to kind of recognize the fears that I was having, but not really addressing them in the most positive way, I guess, or the most productive way, which was fine. That first step, getting to know what the fear was half the work. And I tell people that all the time whenever someone comes to me to be either a client or someone just to get information. I say, it's so important that you did this and that you came to this realization, because that is going to be a lot of the work. A lot of the work is just recognizing that you are afraid of death and dying. And then there is some work to figure out what your thoughts are and how you feel, but that comes with practice. And so it wasn't until right before the COVID-19 pandemic that I started taking a course from my coach, my original coach, Cara Lowenthal. You may have heard about her. She is a very popular coach. I don't work with her one on one anymore or in a group setting anymore either. I do follow her on social media, and I definitely suggest that you do so if you want to manage your mind in any way with work or productivity or, just accepting your thoughts and feelings. I do recommend you go check Cara Lowenthal out, and I'll have her website in the description below. Started doing that in the beginning of March of 2020. That was something that I realized, like, oh, this can really help with death anxiety in particular. And I want to do a separate video just about thought work. But that was kind of my journey. And then when the pandemic started and I started to become more comfortable with the concept of death contemplation and talking to other people about death and dying, that's when I started to do the research on becoming a death doula, becoming a death worker in any capacity, with whether it be education or coaching or advanced care planning and stuff like that, right? So that's when I started doing my trainings. I will do a separate video on my trainings too, I think, because I think that a lot of people who come across the death doula profession want to know how they can become a death doula themselves, whether it be their full-time business. For me, it's part-time right now, and then I work for the BC Hospice Palliative Care Association part-time as well. Want to know how they can have these skills so that whether it be they're a nurse or they're a counselor or anything like that, that they can apply their knowledge in death work as a death doula to that practice. So I will do a separate video on that. So that is kind of my story in a brief, short form. Please let me know if you have any questions, any comments. If you struggle with death anxiety, please email me your story and how you kind of came to that conclusion. My email will be in the description below as well. Add any questions you want to ask me about my journey. I would be happy to answer any questions the best that I can. And now I want to talk about terror management theory. Terror management theory is a psychological theory, kind of a body of research now. It's probably been studied for almost 50 years or so, because it's looking at death awareness and how we deal with death awareness, how we actually buffer our death anxiety when it comes up in our mind. So, what is death awareness? Called mortality salience. So, mortality salience is the same as death awareness when you are thinking about death and dying. Mortality salience comes into the picture. What do we do to kind of buffer it? How do we make sure that we don't kind of panic? Because we as humans have this need for self preservation. We want to buffer it so that we don't get too anxious or we don't panic too much because a lot of the time there's no actual threat. Sometimes we can open a newspaper and see that our favorite celebrity has died, and that can bring up some death awareness. But that being said, in that particular situation, you are not in any danger. For sometimes it can create a lot of panic. So, what happens before it gets to that point? So, in terror management theory, there are two different we usually think about. One is our cultural worldview, and that is the community we live in, the family we live in, the society that we live in, maybe the religion or any spiritual beliefs that you have, is your cultural worldview, right? Even political party and stuff like that. The other is self esteem. So, this is, do you trust yourself? Do you like yourself? Do you believe that you can do hard things? And also, what do you think about death? So, on this side, it's your cultural worldview. What does your cultural worldview say about death or think about death? And then on your self esteem, how do you feel about yourself? Do you trust yourself? Do you trust you're going to be able to handle the ebbs and flows of life? So those two things are something that we normally think about when we think about death, of buffering our death anxiety. We think about those two things. So what I realized when I was studying this, I only started studying this after my undergraduate because one of my professors in university was really engaged with mortality salience and death awareness. I avoided him because I was obviously dealing with my own death anxiety. And I do want to say, if anybody's watching this video and they feel that they don't want to learn any more about death and you don't want to watch this, that's okay. But it was only until I started my death doula practice that I felt really secure in learning more about mortality salience and terror management theory. So when I look back on my experience with death anxiety, I think of these two things: so my cultural worldview and my self-esteem. And to be honest, I struggled with both of those things. In my cultural worldview, again, like I said before, none of the adults wanted to talk to me about it. I did see how our death phobic society in Canada was kind of being displayed. And then the self esteem side, I realized that I didn't have a strong hold on that either at the time. When I was 16 or 17, I know a lot of people struggle at that age. And so it makes sense to me that I was looking for answers in my community and my society, and I wasn't getting it there. And I also I didn't trust myself, and I didn't have a lot of self esteem and knowing that I could get through hard things. And at the time when I was 16 or 17, I did think that didn't really, I didn't have any experience actually living because of the home life that I was in at the time. Is what informs my work. I think a lot about terror management theory and how the tools that Kara taught me can apply to those things, because I think that bringing in your own cultural worldview, like building community, and support system that can buffer that and that you can talk to. For me in the anti MLM community, I really like how every time we talk about a really very awful story that comes up with MLMs with reps taking advantage of people's loss and grief, that we address it and we talk about it and we acknowledge how difficult that is. And that community honestly has given me a lot of a good, like, not that we're at all close, but every time I see another person taking grief and loss and death and dying seriously and wanting to talk about it and wanting to say, like, I'm really sorry that that happened to you, like, that warms my heart, and that brings me so much peace in knowing that there are people that are willing to talk about these stories and to share other people's stories. I think that it does give me hope that community can talk about those things and be aware of them, and be aware that a lot of people are taken advantage of for the grief and loss that they have and the death anxiety they have and stuff like that. The self esteem bit and the cultural worldview bit, both of those things you can cultivate through the tools that I teach and the tools that I learned from Kara. And I'm going to be making a whole other video about thought work, so I want you guys to please subscribe so that you will get a notification for that, and so I can help you out with a free resource with that. So I have one more thing I want to talk about, and that is what death anxiety is and what it is not. So, death anxiety is an extreme fear of death and dying. So, that means that you are probably having panic attacks, you're unable to sleep, you are unable to stop any intrusive thoughts about death and dying, stuff like that. And it's creating a lot of anxiety for you throughout your day, to an extent that it is inhibiting you from doing your day-to-day tasks and living your day-to-day life. Anxiety is that fear and that extreme fear of death and dying, whereas death awareness and just thinking about death and contemplating mortality is not the same as death anxiety. Death awareness can lead to death anxiety. Like I said, if you don't have a good support system or if you don't have strong self esteem, then that death awareness can be kind of elevated and become death anxiety. But I want to say that death awareness is not the same as death anxiety, and that death awareness is actually very normal and natural. And even to a certain extent, I think death anxiety is too, from time to time, right? It kind of has to be a prolonged not being able to live your life. But there are still times where I have days that I have death anxiety, and I know that I'm a little bit more anxious about it. Depends what happens in the day, or what I'm thinking kind of existentially, right? But that being said, it stops there, and it's not a prolonged period anymore, because I do think that I have developed a really good foundation at the self-esteem level, at least. And I'm still working through some cultural worldview stuff and kind of building that support system and making sure that I have people to talk to. And the death positive community has been so good with that, and I adore everybody that I've met so far in this community. I have that. I have that to a certain extent, that cultural worldview now, that support system that really does value talking about it and being open and honest about our feelings. And that's what death positivity is all about for me. I do want to make a full video just about death positivity and what I think about it, and how I kind of define it myself, because I know that it can be kind of uncomfortable for people to think about death positively, and that totally makes sense. I think in my earlier years, if I would have heard that, I would have been like, that doesn't sound very inclusive. That doesn't sound very, that doesn't sound like a fun thing, That doesn't sound like a thing that would help, right? But to define it for myself is very helpful for me. It might not be helpful for others. kind of give me a framework for being open, honest, compassionate to everybody who is thinking about death, who is at the end of life, or otherwise at any stage. I think it's so normal to think about it and also to be afraid of it at some point in our lives too. And yeah. So that is all I have. I do want to say that on Wednesdays I'm going to be posting death positive content, and then on Fridays I'm going to be posting anti-MLM / unethical business practice videos. So this Friday I'm going to be talking more in depth about my experience in the Forex trading multi-level marketing company IM Academy, and I'll be talking about my experience and how I've kind of left off with it, because I think there is a lot to be said about this multi-level marketing company. I think that it is primarily marketed toward men, but I do have an interesting perspective on how they actually market to women as well. So that's all I have for you today. I will see you on Friday. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next time. I'm awkward, so bye!